If you look back at the grand, sweeping arc of human history, we tend to fixate on the loud stuff. You know, the forging of iron, the invention of gunpowder, the discovery of penicillin, or the splitting of the atom. We love a good explosive turning point. But the truth is, the survival of our species, our ability to actually build modern cities and not just die of cholera by age 30, didn't start in a high-tech laboratory or on a battlefield. It started in a dirty, smoky clay pot with a bunch of ancient people boiling animal fat and wood ash. Today, we're talking about a substance so mundane, so incredibly boring, that you probably have 3 different versions of it sitting in your bathroom right now. But wait, don't click away just yet, because the thing sitting next to your sink isn't just a pleasant-smelling luxury. It is a 5,000-year-old chemical weapon. It is an accidental hack in the laws of molecular physics that fundamentally altered the destiny of the human race. This is the bizarre, highly misunderstood, and surprisingly violent history of soap. To really understand how we conquered the microscopic world, we have to travel way back to ancient Mesopotamia, around 2800 BC. The Babylonians were brilliant engineers, but, they didn't know what a germ was. Germ theory wouldn't be accepted for another 4.5 millennia. But they did have a very practical problem. They had sheep. Lots of them. And if you've ever touched a raw sheep's fleece, it is absolutely coated in lanolin, this thick, greasy, waterproof wax. If you want to dye that wool and make clothes, you have to get the grease out. But water and oil, as we all know, absolutely hate each other. They do not mix. So what do? Well, the Babylonians accidentally discovered a process called saponification. I know, big word, but the science here is actually kind of hilarious. They figured out that if you take a heavy lipid, like say cow fat or sheep tallow, and you boil it with a highly alkaline substance, like the white ash left over from a hardwood fire, you force a violent chemical reaction. You aren't just mixing ingredients together like a soup, you are literally ripping the fat molecules apart and mutating them into something entirely new. You see, a soap molecule is basically a microscopic freak of nature. It's a molecule with a split personality. But here is the crazy part. The Babylonians used this chemical magic trick purely as an industrial degreaser. They were cleaning wool, not their bodies. Imagine rubbing boiled animal fat and harsh wood lye on your skin. It would literally burn you. It was essentially ancient bleach. So for a very, very long time, personal hygiene was, it was gross by our standards. Take the ancient Romans, for example. We always think of the Romans as these incredibly clean people because they built those massive, beautiful public bathhouses. But wait, the Romans didn't actually use soap to clean themselves. Instead, a Roman citizen would go into a hot room to sweat profusely. Then they would slather their entire body in cheap olive oil. The idea was that the oil would trap all the dirt, dead skin cells, and the sweat. Then they would take this curved metal tool called a strigil, which basically looks like a dull sickle, and they would physically scrape off the dirty oil off their skin. Yeah, just scraping off a layer of filthy human grease. And they thought this was the peak of luxury. From a scientific standpoint, oil cleansing does actually dissolve other oils, but it doesn't have that mechanical tear the germs apart action that saponified fat has. The Romans were spreading bacteria around, not destroying it. The shift from industrial wool cleaner to thing you put on your face was a slow, painful crawl. Around the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East, chemists finally started making something we would actually recognize today. Instead of gross animal tallow, they started using purified olive oil, and instead of unpredictable wood ash, they used precisely measured sodium hydroxide, and they blended it with aromatic oils like thyme and lavender. For the first time in history, they created hard bars of soap that smelled amazing and, didn't give you chemical burns. This was Aleppo soap, and it became a massive luxury export. When the Crusaders came back to Europe, they brought these sweet-smelling bars with them. But here is where history takes a really weird, dark turn. You would think that once Europe discovered good, clean soap, they would never go back, right? Wrong. In fact, for a span of a few hundred years, Europe became arguably the filthiest place on Earth, and it was entirely because of bad science. Enter the Bubonic Plague, the Black Death. When the plague wiped out roughly a third of Europe in the 14th century, the medical community panicked. They didn't know about fleas or bacteria. They believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air or invisible toxic vapors floating around in the environment. And doctors at the time looked at the human body and thought, wait, if you take a hot bath, your pores open up. And to a Renaissance doctor, an open pore was basically a giant unlocked door for the plague vapors to float right into your organs. So the medical consensus literally became, do not bathe. Water is dangerous. If you wash the dirt and oil off your skin, you are stripping away your natural armor against the plague. I am not making this up. People went months, sometimes years, without submerging themselves in water. Kings and queens of Europe were notoriously filthy. Queen Isabella of Spain famously bragged that she had only bathed twice in her entire life, once when she was born and once when she got married. Instead of washing, wealthy people just changed their linen shirts a lot, hoping that dry fabric would absorb the sweat, and they absolutely drenched themselves in perfumes and heavy colognes to mask the overwhelming stench of, well, rotting skin and body odor. Scientifically, this is fascinating because they were half right about one tiny thing, but for the completely wrong reasons. Thankfully, the madness eventually ended, but it took the Industrial Revolution to do it. And this is where the history of soap stops being a weird cultural quirk and becomes the most important scientific revolution in human history. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, two massive things collided. First, the populations of cities like London and New York absolutely exploded. Millions of people were crammed into tiny soot-filled tenements with no indoor plumbing. Disease was rampant. Typhus, cholera, dysentery. People were dying by the tens of thousands simply from drinking contaminated water and living in filth. Second, science finally figured out how to mass-produce the raw ingredients for soap. A French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc invented a process to synthesize sodium carbonate from ordinary salt. Suddenly, you didn't need to burn forests down to get ash. You could make the alkaline base in a factory, cheaply and infinitely. Around the same time, a guy named Louis Pasteur and another guy named Robert Koch finally proved germ theory. They proved that tiny microscopic organisms were causing these diseases, and that washing your hands could literally snap these organisms in half. The combination was explosive. Governments and health boards realized that soap wasn't just a luxury cosmetic for rich people who wanted to smell like lavender. It was a mandatory shield. It was public health infrastructure. Factories started churning out cheap, uniform bars of soap for the working class. Companies like Procter & Gamble and Lever Brothers built massive empires. They didn't just sell soap. They launched the first massive psychological marketing campaigns in history. This is actually where things get a little manipulative. In the early 20th century, soap companies realized that people were only washing when they were visibly dirty. Like if you had mud on you, you used soap. But how do you sell more soap to people who already look clean? You invent a disease, or at least you weaponize a natural human function. The advertising industry aggressively pushed the concept of BO, or body odor. Before the 1920s, people didn't really obsess over sweating. It was just a thing bodies did. But companies started running these terrifying ads in magazines telling young women that the reason they weren't married, or the reason people were gossiping about them behind their backs, was because they secretly smelled bad and they just didn't know it. They successfully trained the modern world to fear their own natural biology. We became obsessed with sterilization. We wanted to be completely surgically clean all the time. And that brings us to the modern era, where our understanding of soap has actually taken another wild scientific twist. Because in our obsession with killing every germ on Earth, we actually made a huge mistake. You know those bottles of liquid antibacterial soap you see everywhere? The ones that promise to kill 99.9% of germs? For decades, companies added chemical antibiotics like triclosan to their soaps. They told us that regular soap wasn't enough anymore, that we needed chemical warfare. But modern biology proved them completely wrong. In fact, the FDA eventually had to step in and ban triclosan from consumer hand soaps. Why? Two reasons. First, because it was helping to create antibiotic-resistant superbugs, but the second reason is the most poetic part of this entire story. Regular, plain old soap, the stuff derived from the exact same molecular mechanics the ancient Babylonians used 5,000 years ago, is actually superior. Think about it. An antibacterial chemical works like a poison. It tries to disrupt the internal machinery of a pathogen. But bacteria can mutate. They can evolve immunities to poison. But regular soap? Regular soap doesn't poison the germ. It relies on pure physics. Remember those hydrophobic tails? When you wash your hands with plain soap for 20 seconds, those tails aggressively lodge themselves into the lipid membrane of the pathogen. They physically rip the cell wall apart. A virus cannot mutate its way out of basic physics. It cannot evolve an immunity to being physically torn to pieces by molecular tension. Plus, plain soap is surprisingly highly effective against viruses like influenza and coronaviruses, which are literally held together by a fatty envelope. The soap dissolves the fat and the virus just falls apart like a house of cards. And on top of that, we are finally realizing that we don't want to completely sterilize our skin anyway. The human skin is home to millions of beneficial bacteria that eat dead skin cells and fight off the bad pathogens. When we use harsh antibacterial chemicals, we nuke the good guys along with the bad guys. But a gentle, standard soap washes away the loose grime and the most vulnerable pathogens without entirely destroying our natural microscopic ecosystem. So, the next time you go to the store, skip the fancy, aggressive chemicals. When you look back at it, it's almost funny, isn't it? We spent thousands of years building castles, forging armor, and developing high-tech vaccines to protect ourselves. But day in and day out, the most effective bodyguard you have ever had is just a weird, schizophrenic molecule born from fat and ash. It didn't launch any empires, it didn't start any wars, but without it, the empires never would have survived in the first place. It is the invisible bouncer of human civilization, the destroyer of worlds, if you happen to be a microbe. And it's sitting right there on your sink.